But today we are going to continue our summer sermon series looking through the book of Exodus. So far we've looked at Moses when he was a child, when he grew up, and also what I called Moses 2.0 when he redefined himself and restarted a new chapter in his life as a shepherd, completely different and separate from his time in Egypt. And so he spent a lot of time, he probably thought he was going to remain in this other place, Midian, for the rest of his life, but lo and behold, he was called by God through the burning bush to return to Egypt, and his calling was a hefty calling. It was a lifelong calling of setting the people free, getting Pharaoh to free the slaves, to put an end to a 400-year tradition, and to free them and let them go to the promised land and to settle in that land. What a calling that is. He had plenty of excuses why he wasn't the one to do it, but God insisted. And so finally Moses relented, and he and his family went to Egypt. They met with Aaron, Moses' brother. Then they met with the leaders of the Hebrew people, and they convinced them that they were sent by God, and so they actually had hope, which is really something when you think about it. To think of people who've lived in slavery for 400 plus years to have hope is pretty amazing. And that's where we left off last week. Well, today's sermon, there's no way we can cover everything because today's sermon covers chapters 5 through 13 of Exodus, right? If we're going to get through Exodus in the summer, we're going to have to kind of be doing some large quantities of it in one time. But so we couldn't possibly fit the entire story in one scripture reading. We're going through all of the plagues today, so it covers a lot of ground. So to give you an idea of what happened right after we left off, after they talked to the elders of the Hebrews, Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh, and they ask him to let their people go. And not a surprise to anyone who knows the story, Pharaoh did not say that he would let these people go. He did not think to himself, gee, Moses really wants me to end slavery of these Hebrew people. Okay. That's not how Pharaoh works, He didn't let them go right away. In fact, he's very stubborn, and he says, no, I'm not going to let them go. And so Moses and Aaron go back, and things are worse than they were before, because not only that, but Pharaoh assumes the slaves must be lazy, and so he is going to increase their workload. You see, they're making bricks, and instead of supplying the slaves with the materials that they need to make the bricks, now the Pharaoh says that they are going to have to go find the supplies themselves, yet they're still expected to make the same number of bricks as before. So the people don't really look too kindly on Moses and Aaron after this. They lose all hope that he is sent by God. And you can't blame them really. But they lose all hope that he's sent by God. Moses starts to lose hope, and he wonders why God would call him to do something that's not going to work. And so Moses cries out to God about this, and God assures him, I am with you, and you have to keep going here. And so Moses believes it. He tells the Hebrews, his fellow people, that God is still with him and that he is supposed to keep doing this. The people don't believe him. Again, we can't blame them. They had their hopes lifted up for a moment to have them dashed. It's going to be really hard to get their hopes up again. But Moses and Aaron don't give up. They go before the Pharaoh again, and this time they have their magic trick ready. They have the staff, Moses' staff that turns into a snake, and then it's going to turn back into a staff again. The very sign that God set to use with the Hebrew people to make sure that they knew that he was sent by God. So Moses does this to his staff in front of the Pharaoh, but then Pharaoh's magicians are able to do the same thing. Don't ask me how, I don't know. But they were able to do the same thing, and so Pharaoh is not impressed in the least, and he refuses to let the people go. This teaches us something about perseverance, because Moses would have been very frustrated that doing the very thing that God told him to do would not work. Why would that be? And what he learned is that he had to persevere. Sometimes when we do things that we feel God is calling us to do, it doesn't work. Or it doesn't work right away. And sometimes it's because of human error, but sometimes I wonder if it's because that's how God works it, that God realizes that sometimes it's in the struggle that we grow. Not that bad things happen so that we can grow, and it's not always necessarily a bad thing. It's just that sometimes we are called by God to do things that are hard, and sometimes we are called to do things that may not work right away, and it might not have the result that we want right away, but we have to persevere. We have to be persistent. We have to keep going before Pharaoh, even when we've failed before. And so Moses and Aaron, they continue. They continue to go back to Pharaoh, and this is when the plagues start. And so we have this cycle for each plague where they will go before Pharaoh, they will ask that he release the Hebrew people from slavery, and if you don't, Pharaoh, God is going to send a plague of, and then whatever plague it is. Well, Pharaoh would say, I'm not going to do it. So the plague would come. Pharaoh would say, Moses, please pray that this plague will end and I will let your people go. So Moses will pray to God and the plague will end, and then Pharaoh will change his mind and he'll say, I'm not going to let your people go. So be this kind of a cycle over and over again. There are a total of 10 plagues. There are, of course, the first one, the Nile River is turned into blood. The water of the Nile, not just the Nile River, but other bodies of water as well, turn to blood. Some people think that this may reflect or remind the Egyptians of all of the death that they caused by throwing Hebrew children into the Nile. And so it's almost like the blood of those who've passed, who were killed, are crying out. And so the water is turned into blood. There are, I don't think I'm going to be able to list them all from memory, but there's the Nile River, then there are flies, gnats, frogs, locusts, there's darkness for 3 days, there's boils that appear on their skin, there's livestock that become diseased, all kinds of plagues that take place, and then it leads up to the last plague, the final one, which this plague, the death of the firstborn, gets the most space of all of the plagues because there's a lot of build up to it as God is explaining to Moses what is going to happen, explaining how the Hebrews can prepare for it and what they are to do afterwards. Also, interestingly enough, you find it basically a manual or a handbook for how to observe the ritual of Passover for generations ahead in the future. So you have all of this buildup, but basically the idea is God is going to send an angel of death or a destroyer who is going to kill every firstborn child. Now this angel is not able to discriminate and be able to tell who is Hebrew and who is not, and so if you don't want to have your firstborn killed, then you need to have the sign of the blood. You need to put the blood from the lamb on the door, around the door frame of your house. Otherwise, the destroyer angel, he doesn't know who to kill and who not to kill. So he needs to look for that blood in order that he knows. And so the Hebrew people, they do this. They mark their doorposts with the blood, and they prepare ahead of time because the idea is that after this plague, they're going to be free, and they're going to need to leave in a hurry before Pharaoh changes his mind again. And so that's what happens. A firstborn child in every household in Egypt is dead by morning. And the Pharaoh says, okay, you guys can go. Enough. Get out of my sight. I don't want any more of this. And so the people get up quickly and leave, which is why they have unleavened bread, because there isn't time for bread to rise. And so they leave in a quick hurry. And that's where we're stopping our story for today. That's Exodus 5 through 13 in a nutshell. Now, a couple of things about this story and about a lot of stories in the Old Testament, especially in the first 5 books, is that we mentioned this in the Genesis series. These are not isolated stories just all by themselves. They're all connected. All these stories are connected to one another. Genesis, Exodus, they're all connected. And they're all telling the grand story of the Israelites and how they came to be a people and how they ended up in exile. You may remember that common belief is that these stories took their final form while the Israelites were living in Babylon in exile after the land and temple and everything had been destroyed, and they're trying to make sense of it. They're trying to figure out how they ended up this way. But many of these stories that we read in the Bible, they're older than that. They existed before the time of the exile, so it's not as though they just wrote them down in the exile. But nonetheless, most of these stories, it is believed that they were probably first written down. In other words, they may have been communicated orally before that, but they were first written down during the time of the kings. Which makes sense because you would only really have the time and the comfort to be able to write down your stories once you're settled in the land. So this would be after they've been freed, after they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, after they conquered and settled in the promised land of Canaan, after they went through the period of the judges, after they organized a kind of a national government with a king. We have clues that tell us this because in Genesis there's a certain point at which the author says, in those days before there were kings, which tells you that the author is writing from a time period of King David or later when they're writing these stories down. So all that to say that these stories, it's not as though there's somebody who's following Moses around writing things down as they happen. This is written down quite a bit after the events that are spoken of. We also get a hint of that when we see these very detailed technical instructions for how to celebrate the Passover ritual for future generations. Leads some to believe that perhaps this was written from a perspective of a time period when they already celebrated this ritual of the Passover. So just some things that people are thinking about. But as we think about that, that means that these stories might not be 100% historically accurate. As I said, a lot of times when we read stories about history, we know with other kinds of stories about history that it is based on history, but the details might not necessarily be exactly what everyone said. So if we have a dialogue between certain historical figures, we know, well, maybe the conversation didn't happen exactly like that, but we know the gist of what happened. And that's kind of how a lot of the Bible stories work, especially early on. We know that, I mentioned this because of the second thing that I want you to know, and that is that we have some ethical problems with this story. Much like the story of Noah and the flood, we have some ethical problems with this story. For one thing, we have suffering being used as a method to get the Pharaoh to do what God wants. Which we can acknowledge that when it comes to powerful, evil people in the world, sometimes suffering is the only way that you're going to be able to accomplish anything. So we can maybe look past some of these plagues, flies, gnats. Granted, it's a lot worse than it sounds. When we think of a plague of gnats, we're like, it's a lot of gnats, a lot of flies. How many of us hate it when we have one or two of those things in our house, right? It's just, we think we're experiencing a plague when we have two flies flying around the kitchen and we're trying to keep our food covered, But imagine if it was a plague of these things, and it would just be awful. But we can acknowledge, okay, we can look past most of these plagues, but the plague of the firstborn is really hard to look past. Because when is it okay to kill children in order to get what you want? When is it okay to use children as pawns in a game to get what you want, even if what you want is good, like the freedom of slaves? When is it okay? What kind of extreme situation would it take to justify killing the firstborn child of every family in a certain land? And it gets worse than that, really, because we forget that with this plague, the firstborn who are killed include slaves. It doesn't just include those who are in the leadership, who are doing the oppressing. No, every household in Egypt, every slave in Egypt who's not Hebrew, so every household. The only thing that makes a difference is whether or not you're Hebrew. You don't necessarily have to be the one doing the oppressing. You could be a slave for Egypt, but if you're not Hebrew, you're out of luck. So animals are not spared either. So this really butts against our modern sense of ethics and really any time period sense of ethics. And so the question we ask is, when is it okay to do this? When is it okay to use children as casualties in a way to get what we want? Well, if you look at the ancient biblical worldview, you would say plenty of times, right? I mean, the story presents that this was justified in order to accomplish God's will. We have other stories in the Bible where children are routinely used as pawns or killed, sometimes seen as casualties of war, or just, this is the way life is. But imagine that if the United States were going to use this tactic against ISIS. Just imagine if we would threaten them and say, we will kill all of your firstborn children unless you give up your evil ways. Or let's imagine that we knew that if we killed all of the firstborn children of all of the families associated with ISIS, whether they're actually engaging in the activities that some of them do or not. What if we knew that by killing all of their firstborn children, the terrorism would stop? Would we do it? Would it justify the practice? Hopefully you would say no. Because what would happen is we would be lowering ourselves to their level, for one thing. We would be completely losing any kind of moral ground. And we would be engaging in activities that are no better than what they have been engaging in. No, the truth is that there is never a situation where can be justified to kill children to accomplish a goal, even if it is a good one, such as freeing slaves. And so when we are exposed to stories like these, as oftentimes happens in the Bible, it's not that uncommon. Like I said, Noah and the flood is another example. And when we run into stories like this, we have a choice to make. For instance, with Noah and the flood, we can either believe that God is justified in using planetary extinction to accomplish his goodwill in certain circumstances, or we can read the story a little differently and say, perhaps this story isn't exactly 100% accurate, and maybe people even looked at the story back then a little differently than we do now. We can look at this story of the plagues of the firstborn children of Egypt, and we can say, well, perhaps God is justified sometimes in killing children to accomplish his will. Or perhaps we can say that maybe we're reading this story wrong, and perhaps this story may not be 100% accurate. Perhaps with some of these stories, they reflect more about how people thought that God worked in their ancient context rather than how God actually worked in their ancient context. God, what we see in the Bible is that God seems to let his children tell the story. He lets us tell the story. And sometimes we get some things right, and sometimes we may be more or less accurate than other times. But it is hard to believe that killing the firstborn children in Egypt is something that an all-loving, all-compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love God revealed to us in Jesus Christ would actually condone. And so we have a choice to make when we come to these stories and how we read those, how we interpret them, and how we view God. And we have to reconcile that with the picture of God we have in Jesus Christ, because as Christians we believe that God is revealed in Jesus trumps any other image that might be shown to us, even in the Scriptures. So that's the second thing we want to know. But as we continue on, there is another way to think about these plagues. You might notice that the sermon title is called War of the Gods, and you might wonder, why in the world is it War of the Gods? What does that have to do with this story? Well, there are some who believe that instead of being a battle of Moses versus the Pharaoh, that this could be a battle between Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, and the gods of Egypt. And so the plagues can be seen as judgments on the gods of Egypt. So, for instance, when the Nile River was turned into blood, one of the Egyptian gods of water, Osiris, was a god of the underworld, actually, and it was considered that the Nile River was kind of like his life force. And so to see the Nile River turn into blood would have been an affront to their sensibilities. We think of the plague of frogs, and we know that there were Egyptian goddesses. One Egyptian goddess named Hecate, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. This Egyptian goddess is portrayed as having the head of a frog, the body of a woman, but there are many gods that are crocodile-like, frog-like, and so frogs were seen as being kind of sacred in the Egyptian world. And so to have this plague of frogs, where the frogs are completely out of control, and to where you're almost forced to kill these frogs because they're everywhere, the god of the frogs, or whatever you call these gods, they're obviously not able to handle this. We see this in many of the plagues. The boils on the skin, there are gods of healing that are unable to heal these boils. One god named Imhotep, who is a god of medicine, was unable to heal these boils. We have the darkness, the plague of darkness, where this is an affront to the sun god Ra, because basically all of these plagues are showing that their gods are completely powerless to be able to do anything. And so it's interesting, this is reflected in Exodus chapter 12, verse 12. I'll read that for you. Exodus 12, verse 12 says, "On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring," here's the part, "I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord." And so some people believe that this might be more of a contest between the gods, and that God is showing that the Egyptian gods are powerless against him. You see, back then, most people assumed the existence of more than one God. For most of the Old Testament history, but especially early on, most Israelites believed in many gods. They were not monotheists. They did not believe that the Hebrew God was the only God, but they believed that he was the best God, the highest God, the most powerful God, and that their worship should be reserved only for Yahweh, not for any of these other gods that are around in the nations. This is reflected even in the Ten Commandments, the first commandment, which oftentimes we read to mean that there are no gods other than our God. It actually just says, "You shall have no other gods before me." So it doesn't say that other gods don't exist. It's saying, you need to worship me alone. And we see other scriptures where it says, "For I am a jealous God." Well, what's the point in being jealous over something that doesn't exist? So for many of the Israelites, for a good portion of their history, they still believed in other gods, which makes sense. It makes sense of why they would go astray so often and worship all these other gods. It's like, don't you know these gods don't exist? Well, no. They assumed that they did exist. Now, eventually, the faith continued to change and evolve over time, and it became a monotheistic faith where, they acknowledged that and they realized that none of these gods are real. There is only one God. But it took them a while to figure that out. And so, knowing that the Egyptian gods are not real, we could see this as a story of God exposing the idols of Egypt, and exposing their idols as powerless. Now, the question then is, what kind of idols do we have that God exposes in our own lives? There are a lot of things it could be. Sometimes an idol, as we said, we also don't believe in the existence of other gods. We believe in just one God. But so an idol in our life would be something that we place such a high priority that it becomes our number one priority. So for some of us, that might be finances, and yet many of us are realizing that finances are no guarantee that we are going to be set for life, no matter how well off we seem to be with them. Sometimes we claim busyness, and we might not ever say it, but busyness might become like an idol for us, as though being busy, super busy, it's not bad to be busy, but when you become so busy that there's no margin in your life, then oftentimes we can think that that's a virtue. Sometimes we say, "Oh, I'm so busy, I got this and this and that," almost as though that's a good thing, like that's a virtue. as though being busy is the meaning of life, or that perhaps we can avoid thinking about the meaning of life because we're so busy. And yet this pandemic is exposing that, and we are being forced to be less busy. And that can be a good thing, because many of us were reordering our lives, we're doing things differently. And for some people anyway, they've said that when things go back to normal, they may continue to do things a little differently than they did before. So that can be a good thing, even while at the same time it's also sometimes a struggle. So we have a lot of things. Power can be an idol, especially political power. And yet I think that we realize, especially if you live for any length of time, that there is no salvation to be found in voting Republican or Democrat. And so there's the idol of power. There's also the idol even of religious practices. We sometimes tend to think that things like certain practices like worshiping in person, going to a certain building, being able to sing communally, these things are things that we miss. We haven't been able to do these things really since March 15th. It's crazy. And we miss these things because these practices help us connect to God. So when they kind of start to reach idol status, though, is when we assume that the essence of our faith is found in those practices. And when we believe that the essence of our faith is found in those practices, then when we can no longer do them, then we feel as though the essence of our faith is gone. The Israelites, when they went into exile and could no longer go to their temple, and could no longer offer their sacrifices, and could no longer offer the produce of their land, many of them felt that the essence of their faith was gone. And yet they had to adapt, and they did. The faith adapted. And after the exile, they became more of a faith of the book or the scrolls rather than a faith of sacrifice. Sacrifice continued after the exile, but not very long. And once the temple was finally destroyed in 70 AD for the last time, the faith had to really change itself. And they became much more centered on the scriptures than they were before. And they had to change their practices. But even when they were living in exile, they found ways to continue to practice their faith, even when what they once thought was essential for their faith was no longer possible. For us, as we live in this time of exile, when some of the practices of our faith that we once considered essential are no longer possible, at least for the time being, it's good for us to be reminded that those things are not the essence of our faith. The essence of our faith is Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ is always with us. And we can worship Jesus, and we can continue to be the church and serve others without increasing our risk of getting a virus. We can continue to be the church. We can continue to worship Jesus as we've been doing, and as we continue to find new ways to do that. So notice that all of these things that I mentioned, finances, busyness, power, religious practices, none of these things are bad things. There's nothing wrong with finances or power. Power can be used for good. Finances can be used for good. Busyness can be a good thing. We don't want to be lazy either. So it's a good thing to be able to be productive in life and to make a difference. But all good things can become idols when we raise them to such a level of importance that they become almost like a god to us. And God exposes the idols in our lives just as he did so for the Egyptians, exposing the idols in their lives of their false gods who were not actually real. And so, as we continue on, next week we're going to be looking at the Red Sea and how they had to go through on dry land through the sea. But until then, may you remember that Jesus is with you. You can worship God in different ways, and to know a couple of things we get from this story. Number one is the value of persistence. When you try something and it doesn't work right away, don't give up. Sometimes the growth comes in the struggle. We see this not only in the life of Moses, but in the life of numerous people throughout history. In any success story, you will find under the surface a lot of failure and struggle beforehand. So that's one thing. Number two, God is obviously concerned with slavery in this story. God is depicted as willing to do anything and everything in order to free the people from slavery. And so we learn from this story that God is extremely concerned with social justice. Social justice is, sometimes we might think that that's politics. Yeah, and it's also religious, right? So we learn in the Bible that God is very concerned with social justice. And so if we are following God, then we also should be concerned, and we should be seeking to do anything and everything in our power to bring justice to the oppressed. And then finally, we learn that God exposes the idols in our lives. And may we be open to looking for the ways in which we may have idols in our lives, not in a condemning manner to where we just feel bad and shame and condemnation, but such that we might continue to grow in our faith, to put things into proper perspective and to say, you know what, I know where the essence of my faith is, and it's not in any of these other things. It's in Jesus Christ. Amen.